So it was really amazing to look at the dates, the places they have purchased it from. And then I started looking at these names. Who was Edward Foucault? Who was John Grievous? During those days, there was no internet and not much research tools other than the encyclopedias. So I kept on looking for these names, and I found that Edward Foucault was the known scholar of Arabic and Islamic culture of that time. He was the teacher of John Locke.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to the deep dive series of Islam and the Idea of America. My guest today is Dr. Zulfiqar Ali Shah, whose bio is very impressive and certainly went beyond the fictitious borders of the West and the East. Dr. Shah is a scholar of theology and comparative religion with decades of experience in teaching, scholarship, and religious leadership. He holds a PhD in theology and religious studies from the University of Wales in the United Kingdom. And also, he got MA with honors in Islamic studies, specializing in comparative religions from the Islamic University in Islamabad, Pakistan. Over the years, Dr. Shah has taught at institutions including the International Islamic University, the University of Wales, and the University of North Florida. He is fluent in 5 languages, and he has been deeply engaged in interfaith and intrafaith dialogue for more than 30 years. In addition to his academic work, Dr. Shah has served as a religious director for several Muslim communities in North America. He has held national leadership roles, including serving as president of major organizations such as ICNA. Today, Dr. Shah serves as the Secretary General and Treasurer of the Fiqh Council of North America, as well as the Religious Director of Islamic Association of the Greater Detroit. He is also a widely respected international speaker, frequently invited to lecture on topics ranging from comparative religion to theology of Islam, the Quran, Hadith, Islamic law, mysticism, Islamic civilization, the Abrahamic faiths, and the global issues. Dr. Shah is the author of numerous scholarly works and very famous ones. Today, we will be having a deep dive to his Islam and the English Enlightenment, the Untold Story. But his other works are also very impressive. Several of his books have been translated into more than 30 languages. So this is a very impressive bio, and I'm so glad to have this opportunity to speak with you, Dr. Shah. So thanks for joining the show.
Thank you for inviting me, and I'm really glad that you are having this kind of podcast, which is wonderful.
Thank you. Thank you. Dr. Shah, I'm very excited about our conversation indeed, because your book was eye-opening for me. It has been one of the books that made me to rethink about how we teach courses on Orientalism. How do we approach the modern era? How do we approach the Enlightenment and so forth? So it's certainly groundbreaking work with an encyclopedic volume and so important. And I have also greatly benefited from the footnotes and the references in your book. Would you like to share the story behind this book?
The story begins in 1982 when late Professor Ismail Faruqi visited our university in Islamabad because his student who got his PhD from Temple was my dean. So in a conference connected between East-West relations, he made a statement, and he said that the British Empire was made in India and not in London. And without India, there would be no British Empire. So after the lecture, I asked him several questions, And some of my professors who have done their PhDs in SOAS, or School of Oriental and African Studies, they said that the Mughal Empire of 16th and 17th century was the richest empire upon the face of earth. It contributed almost 25 to 28% of world GDP, while England was a small island with a population of almost 5 million, while the Mughal Empire had over 150 million population. And England contributed only 1% of world GDP. And then in 1580, Queen Elizabeth, requested Sultan Murad of the Ottoman Empire to allow English traders and businessmen to trade in the Ottoman Empire. And then in 1600, she requested the emperor, or the, you can say, king of the Mughal Empire, to allow the English to work over there too. So based upon these encounters, the English got connected with the world trade systems and came out of its isolation. And then I remember those professors telling me that they had seen the manuscripts which these English traders, chaplains, sailors, consulars, and ambassadors took from the Ottoman, Mughal, and the Persian empires. And those Arabic, Persian, and Turkish manuscripts are still available in the Bodleian Library, Oxford, or the Rare Books Library, Cambridge. So I remember going to University of Wales in 1990 for PhD. And after the basic formalities, I rushed to go to Bodleian Library to see those manuscripts by myself. And it was so amazing to look at the signatures of Edward Pocock and John Grievous, or Robert Huntington, or Nathan Hales, for example. These were the Levant Company chaplains who purchased these manuscripts from Aleppo, Cairo, Constantinople, Smyrna, or Izmir. So it was really amazing to look at the dates, the places they have purchased it from. And then I started looking at these names. Who was Edward Pocock? Who was John Grievous? During those days, there was no internet and not much of basically research tools other than the encyclopedias. So I kept on looking for these names, and I found that Edward Pocock was the known scholar of Arabic and Islamic culture of that time. He was the teacher of John Locke, Henry Straub, had close relationship with Robert Boyle, and was very much connected with the French, Dutch, and the other Orientalists of that time. And these were the names, John Locke and Henry Straub, or say, for example, Robert Boyle, who were very famous when it came to English Enlightenment, science, for example. So I was just wondering, what is the connection between Islamic and the English Enlightenment? Then I went to University of Cambridge, to Cambridge Rare Books, and found somebody with the name of John Cowell. John Cowell purchased number of scientific manuscripts from Istanbul and from all over the Ottoman Empire. And then I looked and found somebody who purchased some books from Izmir and Istanbul or Constantinople, and his name was Isaac Barrow. So I looked for these names and found out Isaac Barrow was the teacher of Isaac Newton, who taught him at Cambridge. And then Isaac Newton replaced him as the chair of astronomy and mathematics. And John Cowell was one of the chaplains of the Queen of England at one time when she was in Holland. And then he was the vice chancellor when Isaac Newton was a student, and then later on became a professor there. And Isaac Newton closely cooperated with John Cowell when it came to the politics of Cambridge as well as the scientific subjects. So that's where my curiosity began. What is the relationship between the Muslim world and Britain? And that's where this book started in 1990. So I have been collecting this material, connecting the dots between various figures, various manuscripts, and how things came into being. And I was really surprised to know that in 1632, the first chair of Arabic was established at the Cambridge University by Sir Adams. And I was just wondering, why would they start Arabic language in 1632? While in Cambridge, there was not much scientific study going on at that time. No physics, no chemistry, no biology, none of those departments. And then I looked at the history and found that in 1636, the first chair of Arabic was established by the Archbishop William Laud. And the first professor of Arabic was Edward Poco, who learned Arabic in Aleppo and lived in Aleppo and then in Constantinople. So I was just wondering why Arabic, and I found out that Arabic was thought to be essential to understand the Semitic languages like Hebrew and Syriac, but it was also important for the sake of overseas trade with the Ottoman and the Mughals. So when I looked at the names, William Laud, he was very much interested in Arabic. He was the one who established the first Arabic printer in Oxford. And Sir Adams was one of the Levant Company merchants, and he was also a shareholder or a director in East India Company. So this way, I was just wondering, I said it was not only religious reasons that they established the Arabic departments or chairs, it was also something connected with knowledge, with ideas, with contract law, with kind of communications with the Muslims in the Ottoman as well as the Mughal and the other states like the Barbary state. So I found that a lot of exchange have taken place between the Muslim world and the Britain of that time. And then after the research, it was kind of clear that scientific revolution, industrial revolution, democracy, modernity, all of them were kind of co-constituted, co-constructed. It was not just European business. It was not, England did not do it by itself. It was helped by the Muslim and by the other civilizations.
That's very impressive. Really, this cross-pollination and the connected histories, the shared history, that exchange is very much articulated, I think, in the best way possible in your book. It's so impressive. And I think you all offer also in your book a powerful critique of Max Weber's largely Eurocentric account of modernity. And again, I'm a sociologist by training, and especially Max Weber and other sociologists' perspectives are very much prominent, and really the current story of the Enlightenment and modernity. Although this may not be really accurate when you look at these names, these connections, and we have more opportunities, as you suggested. We can do better research in these days. And I found your argument especially persuasive as a sociologist, and I think that um, English trade networks and how global commerce at that time shaped the identity of the modern England and also the Enlightenment era is the most intriguing chapters. And perhaps some of these things, these connections, are overlooked because you are going to the names, right? Following the ideas. You're kind of doing a map of knowledge, I think, and that's very valuable. So, what do you see as the most important, overlooked, most surprising things that's not told? Because you're saying you're telling the untold story, and that's what I loved.
Sure. Actually, when you look at the story of modernity or story of enlightenment, the Eurocentric Whiggish scholars, they tend to connect it all the way back to the Greco-Roman civilization. So we are told, and it has become a kind of standard explanation, that Greco-Roman civilization begot Christendom, and from there we go all the way to 16th century Italian Renaissance. Italian Renaissance led to 16th century Protestant Reformation, and the Protestant Reformation led to what we call the Enlightenment, especially the English Enlightenment. And from Enlightenment, we have the American Revolution, the French Revolution, democracy, rights, and science. But it was really intriguing to see that between the Greco-Roman civilization and the Italian Renaissance, there were centuries, almost 1100 centuries. I mean, Rome fell in late 5th century, and from that time on, there was not much of a science, much of philosophy, much of Aristotle or Galen in what we call Europe. And that's what the European scholars themselves call the Dark Ages. And during this time, Aristotle, Galen, and many of the Greco-Roman philosophers and medical scientists, they were translated, preserved by the Muslims during the time of Mamun, the Abbasid Caliph in Dar al-Hikmah, where the Jewish, Christian, and Muslim scholars worked together to translate those works of the Greco-Roman scholarship into Arabic. And then this synthesis was created between the Muslim, Christian, and Islamic civilization. Muslims did not create this synthesis by themselves. They got help from the Persian civilization, from the Indian civilization, from the Egyptians, from the Greco-Roman, but then they created a hybrid of these civilizations in light of the Qur'anic concept of Tawheed or monotheism, or Qur'anic concept of human dignity or human innocence, or amal salih, or what we call the good deeds. So mostly thoughts were from all over the world, but then the hybrid or the synthesis was Islamic. Now, Christendom was going through the Dark Ages, banning the Greco-Roman philosophers, even Aristotle, many of those, and actually declaring them as the pagan or polytheistic writers. It was in the 11th and I would say 12th century when Spain was reconquered and the translation movement began there in Spain. And from there and Sicily, and also because of the Crusade connections, these books were translated and transmitted to basically Europe and especially southern Italy. So you have got what we are told, the 12th century Renaissance. So St. Thomas Aquinas, number of others, these big names, they were interacting directly with the Muslim translated books of Aristotle and Greco-Roman philosophy, and they kind of copied what Abu Ali Sina did, what Al-Farabi did, what especially Ibn Rushd did. And, St. Thomas Aquinas mentions Ibn Rushd almost 500 times in his Summa, for example. And he is clearly interacting with Ibn Sina, with Farabi, and he is interacting directly with Moses Maimonides, the rabbi, who was born in Muslim Cordoba and was basically expelled from there, lived in Morocco for a little time, and then migrated to Egypt and became the personal physician of Salahuddin al-Ayyubi, the Saladin, and died in Cairo. And he also transmitted a lot of Muslim philosophy, Muslim mysticism, Muslim political thought, and St. Thomas Aquinas closely dealt by name with Rabbi Maimonides. So what happens after that, that the Italian city-states like Venice, like Amalfi, like Genoa, for example, and Florence, these were small city-states. So they started having business dealings, and they have been having these business links with the Muslim Mamluk world since the time of Crusades. And actually, the modern historians prove that Crusades were more economic deals than just the religious parts. So these people are dealing with the Ottoman Empire, and especially with Alexandria, Mamluk, and getting the Indian goods through the Muslim sources. So the money made in that kind of overseas trade was the sources of what we call the Renaissance in the Italian states. Now, even when you look at the Reformation, you have to look into the context of the Catholics and the Ottoman rivalry. We know from 1536, when the Ottomans besieged Vienna first time, we know that the Franco-Ottoman alliance was constructed in 1536 originally between Suleiman the Magnificent and Francis I of France, when Francis I was defeated by the Spanish king and imprisoned along with his children. So his mother sent a request to Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent for help. And Sultan Suleiman went and attacked Vienna and constructed what we call a kind of buffer state between France and Spain. And from that time on, the Franco-Ottoman alliance took place in 1536 and 39. So this rivalry between Catholic, Spanish, Habsburg, for example, dynasty, and between the Ottoman was the reason or one of the factors that the Protestant Reformation became successful, because without the pressure of the Ottomans, the Habsburg king would have never allowed Protestant leaders any success as they have done it in the past to so many dissenting sects. So, and basically even the Reformation, Luther felt so close originally to Islamic religion. He praised Islamic religion, its sense of submission, duty towards God, moral discipline, ethics, simplicity, and even praised Muslims' direct relationship with God, with the scripture, sola scriptura, and also anti-clericalism, in a sense, that there's no mediation between God and human beings, no indulgences, and especially when it came to the statue worship or icon. So you would see that the Queen of England, 1580, Queen Elizabeth, when she sent the letter to Sultan Murad, she mentioned these commonalities, that we are closer to you, the Unitarian Islamic religion, than these Catholic adultery, for example. So you would see that even Reformation could be looked in the context of the Ottoman and the Habsburg rivalry. So even when you looked at this linear genealogy, which is given to us from Greco-Roman all the way to what we call the English Enlightenment, lot of interactions are taking place between the Muslim world, and the Christian world, and a lot of contributions were made by the Muslims into what we call the Renaissance, Reformation, and the English Enlightenment.
Yeah, I think this is a very fascinating history, and you really summarize maybe a millennia. But when we come to your chapter on alchemy and the natural philosophers, I think this is really setting the stage. Now when we are coming to 1600s, and we are seeing these big names very much benefiting from the Arabic writing and these exchanges. I think, frankly speaking, many of your discussions is perhaps unexpected for many readers. It's just fascinating because it opens a very different window onto the intellectual world that eventually produced modern science. And could you please unpack that world for us? How alchemy and religion and natural philosophy intersected in ways we often forget today?
Sure. Now, look at these traders and sailors and business people living in the Ottoman cities like Istanbul, like Izmir, like Cairo, and interacting with the Muslim scholars, Muslim scientists, Muslim theologians, and having this kind of cross-cultural dialogue and diffusion. And imagine also England of 17th century, which is very impoverished, agrarian, not much of science or not much of, I would say, state building. And even when it comes to the scientific disciplines, and looking at the Muslim empire's richness, and actually we are told that the Mughal emperor, on his birthday when he came out, the English ambassador Sir Roe, he wrote a report back and said, I couldn't figure out where was the emperor because he had so many diamonds, rubies, gold, and so much of these, you can call it luxuries. So the question came that Muslims were very much into alchemy, or some of the scholars were very much into alchemy. And if you look at alchemy, it was founded originally in ancient Egypt, and from there it was taken over by the Muslims in Baghdad and elsewhere. And from that place, it was transmitted through Spain and Sicily to England and to Europe. So Muslims, basically these big Muslim names were the big names of alchemy. Even the King of England, King Charles II, became so much connected with alchemy that he established the alchemy labs in his own palace and even in his own private quarters. And then some of the scholars have even mentioned that the establishment of Royal Society was also connected with these kind of alchemy lab works or experiments. So these books of alchemy became the source of attraction for many natural philosophers in Europe and especially in England. Robert Boyle, for example, he spent his entire life studying alchemy. Isaac Newton spent his entire life studying and writing about alchemy. John Locke, just like Robert Boyle and Isaac Newton, was so much mesmerized by alchemy. And actually, we are told that Isaac Newton wrote more about alchemy than about physics or science. And he connected alchemy with the religious thought of that time as Robert Boyle did it. So, what was the connection between alchemy and between the religious thought of that time? Remember that in the Reformation time, from the Reformation time onward, there was a conflict between the Catholics and the Protestants, whether Lutherans, Calvinists, or the Anglican. The 30 Years' War killed so many English, and basically the early part of the 17th century England was crushed by this civil war between the Catholics and between the Protestants. So religion became the source of dissension and discord, and many people looked at it from the perspective of absolute church and the absolute monarchy. Remember that from the time of St. Augustine, this concept of divine right monarchy and divine right church was propagated in the medieval Christianity, and the medieval church insisted that it has the divine right prerogative of coercing people to become religious or to conform to one law, one king, and one church. So a lot of religious persecution was taking place when it came to the Puritans and when it came to even the Protestant dissenters. So the religious, or you can call the early Enlightenment figures, they really wanted to look at something which is minimal, which is rational, which is moral, and which takes away England from the theoretical discussions of miracles, of dogma like Trinity, like original sin, like many of those which were the bone of contention. So at that time, they wanted to make a move from the miraculous, from the mystery-based word of dogma to something which is rational, logical, and natural. So what we call the mystical philosophy or theology, or what we call the supernatural theology to natural theology, that discussion and conflict was going on in the early as well as the middle 17th century England. So what alchemy did, alchemy was kind of experimentation, which brought different kinds of substance together and have the verification as well as the repeatability. So this was giving them a sort of knowledge which was more natural, which was authentic, and it gave them the opportunity to refute those church authorities which based the knowledge only upon revelation or church tradition, or just because they were the kings or because they were the bishops. So the natural philosophers used alchemy and experimentation and basically the type of mutation from one substance to the other substance as a sort of alternate for the theoretical dogma or for the mystery-based explanation of the universe and the cosmos. So it became the alternate to the supernatural theology, a theology which is natural, based upon the divine laws in the nature, in the cosmos. So by means of studying those divine laws or natural laws, people can have certainty and can have the alternate from the uncertain supernatural theology of church and divine right coercion.
And you also make a striking claim that the European Enlightenment was not simply a secular break from religion, but in many ways, you say it was a religious revolution. I think this was very interesting. So I think that is a very powerful corrective to the standard secularization narrative. So how would you explain this idea to our audience? Why does it matter for how we understand enlightenment?
Remember that the England or Europe of the 16th, 17th, and even 18th century was totally God-oriented. It was a religious theology, political religious theology of divine right and divine right church. And the Enlightenment was sort of reaction against that religio-political theology of absolutism. So therefore, the early Enlightenment discussions, all of them revolved around Christian theology. And scholars like Pocock, for example, or J.D. Clark, or Jonathan Israel, say for example, or a number of other modern scholars, they have concluded that almost all early Enlightenment discussions were revolving around the concept of original sin, Trinity, and divine right monarchy and absolutist church, because these were fundamental to the political and religious system of the 17th century England. The king claimed that he is not responsible to the parliament, not responsible to anybody, because he is appointed by God, so he is responsible only to God. Church claimed that it speaks on behalf of God, and it is closer to the biblical interpretations, and its traditions are absolute, nobody can challenge it. The king and the church also claim that they have got the divine right to punish other people, to coerce them into submitting to their authority, because they are required by God to absolutely submit to that authority. So all of these dissenting sects, Unitarians, Socinians, Presbyterian, Methodist, Baptist, Quakers, all of them were punished based upon this absolute divine right monarchy. And the base of that was what we call the concept of original sin, that God created man in his own image, but because of Adam and Eve's mistake, they were thrown from the heavens, and because of this fallen nature and because of this original sin, now human nature is wretched and human nature is evil. So God has created the institution of king to control human nature and create law and order in the society. For the spiritual well-being, God has created the church. So there was no salvation out of church, and there was no salvation without the magistrate or without the king. So the original debate of the Enlightenment figure was about the nature of human being, whether it is innocent, good, or based upon the original sin, wretched. And that's where the Islamic concept of fitra came handy, that God has created human beings innocent, and it is the environment which makes a person Jew, Christian, or Muslim good or bad. Second thing was the concept of Trinity, because in Christian world, this whole concept of God the Holy Father, God the Son, and God the Holy Spirit, this hierarchical Trinity was used to create a kind of stratified society or hierarchical society. So king represented God the Father. He was like God the Father, basically father of everybody in the empire. The nobility represented God the Son, power, dominion, and the priest, they represented God the Holy Spirit. So everybody, 98% of commoners were created to support, to help, and to labor for these three realms of superior estates. So if you look into England, if you look into France, if you look into Italy, you look even all the way to 17th and 18th century, this stratification of three realms of state, nobility, clergy, and you can say the king or the royalty ruling the pyramid, and commoners supporting and helping and paying the taxes, that was common based upon the concept of Trinity. So divine right monarchy and divine right absolutist church were based upon this concept that king is needed to control the unruly human beings based upon their wretched nature, and the church is needed for the spiritual welfare. So therefore they are responsible only to God and not to anybody. But the Enlightenment figures, they were reacting to this old regime political thought and old regime religious theology. So they discussed and analyzed original sin, Trinity, and divine right monarchy and divine right church. So therefore, scholars are kind of now having a sort of consensus that the Enlightenment was something which is theological in nature. It was discussion between Christians about the original nature of Christianity, the corruption of church after the, say for example, Emperor Constantine adopting or co-opting the church, and the original monotheism or the original theology of Jesus and Moses. And that's where they used Islam as a mirror, because the Ottoman Empire did not have this concept of divine right king, but were responsible, Sultan was responsible to Quran, to Sharia law, and responsible even to the religious leadership. At the same time, there was no concept of original sin. It was a kind of agreed upon system of government that the Sultan or the Caliph will provide law and order and justice, and the people will obey. So therefore, this was very helpful mirror, and the Protestant Enlightenment figures used the person of Prophet Muhammad and the Ottoman Mughal empire as the mirror, and they started analyzing and refuting divine right monarchy and divine right church.
Right, right. So this is, I think, a great segue to the influence of the English Enlightenment on the French Enlightenment, on the American Revolution, American Enlightenment and Revolution, right? So I like to just trace this influence, how you trace in your book of Socinian and Unitarian thought, particularly on their views on reason, conscience, and monotheism. And would you like to explain a little more of those connections and why they are so important in understanding the intellectual roots of the United States?
Look at Socinianism or Unitarianism, you would see that they began in what is nowadays Hungary or Poland, for example, the areas which were under the influence of the Ottomans, and the Ottomans kind of supported the Socinians as well as the Polish Socinians as well as the Unitarians. So when they were persecuted in Poland and elsewhere, many of them migrated to Holland and to England, and some of them to France. And they were the ones who initiated many of these discussions about Trinity, about the concept of tradition versus reason, or the concept of freedom of religion and freedom of thought. Now, in England or in whether Catholic or Protestant churches, uniformity was required of all believers. One church, one king, and one law. They did not allow pluralism or diversity of belief system, or what we call the freedom of conscience. While the Ottomans and the Mughals, they allowed the Christian, the Jews, the Hindus, the Sikhs, and all of them to live in a Muslim state, pay poll tax or jizya, and have their own religious independence, have their own churches and synagogues and temples, and actually have their own courts. So when the English went to the Ottoman Empire and they looked at this religious pluralism, and especially this Islamic concept of there's no compulsion in the matter of religion, they came back and they wanted to have the same kind of freedom, especially the Quakers, Socinians, and the Unitarians who were persecuted by the crown as well as by the Anglican Church. So these people, they started asking for freedom of religion, for freedom of conscience. And they, instead of looking at the tradition, also started rational discourse and challenging Trinity, original sin, or some of the interpretations which were given to the scripture based upon tradition and authority and not based upon a logic or history. So if you look into the 17th century England, Socinians and Unitarians, they used the Islamic model of oneness of God against the Trinitarian concept, and the Ottoman and the Mughal models of religious freedom against the coercion or persecution in England, and also reason versus the church tradition. So even John Locke, for example, Isaac Newton, or Henry Stubb, they were pro-Unitarian or pro-Socinian, and their opponents attacked them as Muslims, as Turks, as Moors, and as Socinians. So these Socinians and Unitarians, when they were persecuted in England, many of them migrated to the American colonies. For example, in Boston, many of those early Puritans were proto-Unitarians. They came and they established the churches which allowed dissension, freedom of conscience, and rational discourse rather than authoritarian church traditional perspective. They challenged the supernatural theology of the church, especially the original sin, Trinitarian as well as divine right monarchy and divine right church. And it's astonishing to see that the establishment of what later became Harvard University was done by these early Puritans. And, there is a direct connection between the Arabic taught at Cambridge and Oxford and between the establishment of Harvard University. First of all, let me say a few words about the establishment of Harvard University. It was established in 1636, and the governor of Massachusetts at that time was Sir Henry Vane. Sir Henry Vane was very independent Christian who believed in the freedom of conscience, who did not believe in the Trinity and probably not even in the original sin. He was very much against divine right of kings or the church persecution, and he supported the dissenters when he was the governor of Massachusetts. That's where he was called the Vane or the Quran Vane, because he was blamed that he is not following the Bible of Jesus, but the Muslim Bible, the Holy Quran. He was called the Turk, the Moor, and he was called half Musliman or half Muslim. If you look at the first two presidents of what later on became the Harvard University, both of them were proto-Unitarian. They were the graduates of Cambridge University, where in 1632 the first Arabic chair was established. So they learned Arabic language as part of their study of Semitic languages. And they introduced Arabic language in Harvard from the very beginning of the college or university. Now, some of the graduates, if you look at the names like William Bentley, for example, William Bentley, after graduating from Harvard and teaching there for 3 years, took the position of minister or priest in Salem. And he was very active Unitarian who debated the Calvinists when it came to Trinity, original sin, divine right monarchy, divine right church. And he wrote detailed diary in which he defended Prophet Muhammad as anti-clerical Protestant prophet. He defended Islam as rational, moral, monotheistic, strict monotheistic religion, and he wanted to purge Christian Trinity and other corruption based upon the mirror and the model of Islamic religion. Therefore, you see that, like William Bentley, you see Joseph Priest, who was originally the leader of the Unitarians in England. And when he was persecuted, his house was burned, his lab and his library was burned. So he migrated to Philadelphia and established the first Unitarian church there in Philadelphia. Benjamin Franklin was his close friend. John Adams and Thomas Jefferson attended that church, and all three of them became Unitarian. So therefore, you see that people like Joseph Priestley, William, Bentley, and others, they were in the forefront of Unitarian theology, and they were also in the forefront of what we call influencing some of the founding fathers. And some of these founding fathers, especially Benjamin Franklin, he also became anti-Trinitarian. John Adams was called the mad Unitarian. So they criticize Trinity, they criticize clericalism, they criticize church persecutions, they criticize absolute church and absolute monarchy, and they wanted to establish a republic which is based upon Unitarianism, based upon rights, based upon freedoms, and based upon religious pluralism. If you look at Thomas Jefferson, he wrote a lot against Trinity. He called it nonsense and absurdity. And he basically purchased the copy of the Quran when he was a student. And then he purchased another copy of the Quran when his original copy was burned. He purchased it when he was in France. So if you look into the history of Thomas Jefferson, he studied the Quran and wrote notes on the side of the text. And then he also picked up a razor and went to the Bible and started cutting the pieces which he thought were kind of corruptions or additions to the original Bible. And that copy of Jefferson's Bible is still available in Smithsonian Museum. And his copy of the Quran is available in the Library of Congress. So if you look into what he did, most of the time he will go to anthropomorphic or some of the violent chapters or passages in the Old Testament, and he would cut it. And he also went to the New Testament, and anything which did not coincide with monotheism or with morality, he basically just removed it from the Bible. And this is what is called Thomas Jefferson Bible. And in that, you will see only monotheism, concept of one God, no concept of original sin, only moral and ethical teachings. And many of the scholars have concluded that there is a clear-cut sign of influence of Qur'anic monotheism and anti-clericalism and anti-absolutism. If you look at one of his letters, which he wrote to his nephew, he clearly stated that American Republic was being established on the principles of Unitarianism, and he wished that every young American would not die but a Unitarian. So therefore, what I see is that American Revolution was the culmination of that Socinian, Unitarian, and deist political as well as religious theology, which revolted against the absolute king and revolted against the absolute Anglican Church and wanted to have religious plurality and religious freedom and rights established in the American Republic.
Yeah, it's really a fascinating history, fascinating connections. I know you are currently working on several book projects, new projects, including on Islam's influence on the French Enlightenment, which really deserves conversation of its own. But I look forward to our future conversations. And Winnie, as we are wrapping up today, could you please give a glimpse of where that research is heading and what the readers should be excited about next?
Actually, the English Enlightenment, American Enlightenment, and the French Enlightenment were sort of interconnected. As we have got Henry Straub, there in England, we have got Henry de Boulainville, one of the leaders of the French Enlightenment, writing a book about Islam and Prophet Muhammad and strict Islamic monotheism, no priest, no, persecution, religious persecution, and inviting the French to learn from the Muslims and purify Christianity based upon Islamic monotheism and Islamic, what they, some of the scholars will call it republicanism. So also Voltaire, sometimes he is kind of condemning Islam and sometimes he is appreciating the Quran. And in the end, he was very much appreciative of Islamic monotheism, and his Unitarian or deistic views were a reflection of what is this dyadic relation with the Islamic theology. And then Napoleon himself, we know that he went to Egypt and declared himself Muslim, and then all of his appreciation. So many of those areas were kind of intersected with the English as well as the American Enlightenment. Joseph Priestley lived there after migrating from England. Thomas Paine one time lived there. So these Americans, English and the French Enlightenment figures intersected with each other a lot, so a lot of connections there. I'm also working on the Islamic horizons of John Locke, because John Locke is the most important figure in the Enlightenment, and he was very much influenced by Islamic concept of religious freedom, monotheism, and also Islamic concept of man. And I think now the scholarly consensus is that he read Hayy bin Yaqzan of Ibn Tufail, and his individualism, subjectivity, or empiricism is very much based upon that philosophical knowledge of Ibn Tufail. I'm also working on the Alchemy of Robert Boyle and its connection with Islamic heritage, and working on Henry Straub and Islam. So a number of projects are coming along. So I hope and pray that I would be able to complete many of them pretty soon.
That's awesome. That's really fascinating. You're working on maybe 4 book projects at the same time, but these are all very much connected to what you have been producing in more than now 25 years, right? So and maybe 35, right? So
Close to
it's
40 years.
fascinating. Maybe 40, yes. So it has been a pleasure talking to you. Thank you so much for joining the show. And I really look forward to our future conversations, Dr. Shah. Thank you.
I really enjoy your podcast, so please continue doing this wonderful work.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much.